You know, when you look back at the history of Pixar or Disney, you always pick your favorite or least favorite villains, where in this case, it's time to really dive into the realm of the most pathetic or most hated ones. Or in fact, we should go as far as to say the most stupid villains ever existing, thinking it was a mistake that they ever decided to go with such a thing. Because I don't think there was any villain produced by Disney or especially Pixar in this case that is just so terrible unlike this one, doing the most dumbest plans imaginable from a twist that never even worked. Like someone that should be a good idea for the message of The Incredibles in that particular world, but how that the movie turned that on its head with a poorly structured sequel. Something I remind you I've talked about time and time again in each video. I've said on a bunch of villains as the sole reason why I thought Incredibles 2 did not stack up to the height of its predecessor, being more mediocre than it ever could have been in a villain like Evelyn Deavor, the woman behind the screenslaver bent on the preservation of the law that kept those supers illegal in society, consequences of the first film that was the main idea for the second. I mean, you already knew that was going to be a focus since it wasn't fully resolved at the end of the first, but the fact that the villain itself revolved around prevention of such things in the way it's already been solved in the first film and her own crap explanations just did not feel observed nor like a great addition to those original film's themes. Again, the idea that the Deavors were not bad for the story in focus, but how they went about it in the wrong way, separating one bad and one good based upon the simple idea that their dad died because he wanted to call a bunch of supers after they couldn't do jack from a stupid law. Like when you base yourself in that background, you realize how bad such a broader story feels compared to the idea that the original presented, when it came to ideas like insurer care, the tragic background of syndrome, and the broader idea of what is right versus what is wrong in society and the mediocrity involved with that. But with these short viewpoints out of the way, let's instead head back at the very beginning and another disappointment that continued after the end of the first film. This begins with the Underminer as that new foe that threatened the city, resolving an unresolved cliffhanger by making him escape. Like you begin this new battle and world that completely resulted in nothing happening and a villain that got away. We mentioned this scene greatly because of that action and the question of how he never again appeared after that, being unscathed and winning to some degree while we still deal with the larger problems involved with supers being illegal, with some people just being stupid to see that point when they help prevent more destruction. The only reason they didn't make him a big villain in this part is the fact that John Ratzenberger, Pixar's Lucky Charm, actually voiced him, and he was more of a cameo role like the rest of the other characters he has done in the past, not including Ham in this argument. That overall, it still wasn't the main focus because we have to circle back again on the bigger picture of supers being illegal in society and playing that into the message that affected certain people similar to Syndrome feeling betrayed at the class of people that they looked up to. So you know, the stereotypical bad guy that they had at the beginning would unfortunately be written out and not focused for those very reasons, even if he could have had an agenda on his own, especially if he escaped like that, but deciding it was good to leave it as that for some reason because this was more important to tell. The first sign that showed the problem that the film would overall have when the ideas were just tossed aside for something later, or never in this case. So instead, later in the film, after Frozone contacts Bob and Helen, they go to meet with the Deavors who want to work with them again to solve their greatest problem. This is the intro to Winston Deavor, the head of a world-class telecommunications company who advocates for the return of supers after his own father, where you notice he is voiced by Bob Odenkirk, who is most known as everyone's favorite criminal lawyer Saul Goodman, a fact that's not hard to see in some cases of comparing to how they actually present things. Like you can see that in the way that they show things about changing perception or even orchestrating most events to change such public opinion, which both characters really do, and are in some way villains to modern heroic society. A fact that you can make wonder what is behind this character's agenda, as a businessman coming to the supers making them legal again for his own personal gain. We do not know much about him other than the fact his father is a superhero advocate and he runs this big huge company. Stuff that I really want to talk about in a way working compared to who it really is, being his own sister Evelyn, who appears shortly after. The final intro of the subject matter, who just appears as the tech sibling of DevTech, who really helped the company to what it is as a media and technology empire, while he was just the business side of things. At first, there's nothing really harmful on her part of the world, being like a regular person helping while they go through the backstory of the works of their father. Again, the biggest superhero advocate in the world before he died tragically, and how he led this life that led to this line and was shot because he wanted to call for help from the supers even while they could not answer such calls anymore because of the fears of the law that just passed. And then how she explains that only if he listened to their mother, they probably would have been safe getting hidden instead of being shot in the robber's view. The film here wants you to focus and present this idea not on the lax sister in the way she speaks compared to the passion that the brother displays, and help lead this charge and change for the superheroes to come back. And you have to keep your eyes on this idea because it centers in the big moment that impacts the story moving forward. Again, what happened to the consequence of the world by the glory days that happened in the beginning, and moving forward with that idea, presenting what we do and what we fight for. Fighting from the death of a loved one somehow connected to the mistake of the law that played into that major consequence. This is where the choice is laid down to Elastigirl to be the leading figurehead of this charge, and how the roles are switched between father and mother. Again, Winston is still at the head of this and still very excited at the opportunity, leading to certain events where you might think his motives are darker, calling the city a superhero's playground against crime.
You want to make a big crime fighting statement? You go where the crime is big.
Strange thing to be excited about, Winston.
Well, it's like a superhero's playground.
Which is something we never should be excited about instead of stopping, because it's really a duty to justice, not a fun event because we just have powers, as we all know it does carry responsibility with it. This is where the first test comes in with the incident involving the high-speed rail that was just built moving the wrong way when the pilot gets incapacitated and hypnotized by the screen, welcoming Elastigirl to her new apparent villain known as the Screenslaver. A question of mystery and intrigue that you don't really know what it points to other than the next suspicious behavior behind the scenes of how this was set up by the Deavors, aiming for this specific event that did happen after they put her in that position. Fairly obvious if you might say, rather than a twist that's supposed to be shocking. Now I will give it credit for having the right idea. When we do things like her being interviewed talking about her position she's fighting for, and then revealing the control of screens that this figure likes to actually do to set off a more dangerous point than we realize. We realize the growth of technology and media coming into play in society, that DevTech is also responsible in charge of that very perception. An enemy in control of technology against supers is far more dangerous than you think, and actually great for the plot of the film. Remember, the impact syndrome had alone with its mind creating omnidroids that almost wiped out all the supers in existence and changing that perception yet again. Now having the Screenslaver control minds through technology to take control of transportations, opinions online, and anything you name it, trying to kill the ambassador and stopping any attempt that could actually benefit the supers, saving the ambassador in the process to prevent such a great tragedy in the end. And again, you're led to believe that Winston could somehow be behind such events because he's looking for the positives of how each thing she does is seen as a great movement to help public opinion shift towards the return of supers, but not really convincing her it's playing to the advantage when the villain has gotten away. That instead of her negatives that this figure is still out there, he looks at the positives like it's on track to actually making everything right. A hidden agenda that could be for their own nefarious gain. Where then, after this, she talks to Evelyn after meeting with the other supers for the first time about how she loves the inventive side of things rather than the business side, trying to lead Elastigirl on about the clues of who the villain really is. One who hides in the shadows with the agenda against supers using technology to their advantage, and why some opinions are not what they seem. We already know she is, demonstrated by her lackluster attitude about things. Well, not that we know as first timers, but later on how everyone on this side demonstrates this suspicious happy attitude about doing these such things. They're not on edge about events that could have affected the path forward because someone almost died, leading to the moment where we do find Screenslaver to go against Elastigirl, and finally revealing he was just some random dude who didn't know what happened after destroying the evidence she needed, a force that revealed a higher power at play, because the guy was actually just the pizza delivery guy who didn't really protect his apartment very well to be revealed easily, trying to tempt her in to solve a certain point, but actually helping whoever is behind them in the first place. The point of seeing that there was screens in the Screenslaver's dominion that was actually connected to Elastigirl's suit. That confirms it points to the people who has been helping us all this time, and actually seeing that it was lying in the obvious answer in the person next to her by the way she answers things and responds to such statements. Finally realizing that her name is also a play on the words evil in Deavor, if that wasn't any more obvious that we actually saw. Instead of your thoughts going to the lackadaisical attitude of Winston, who is positive out of every win against Screenslaver, you finally realize that the tech being used is similar to the one behind the scenes for the majority part part of these operations in someone like her. Her being late, her not being involved with Elastigirl holds for the actual business and creative parts, and then her own response to what could have happened to their own parents. And although to the naked eye, with what could have been talked about doesn't seem like an overall bad idea, and has interesting layers to it to reach such a point, that argument for her being a villain falls flat after she confirms it herself. That her argument for being a villain is just not very good, because the genius of a villain is not in the execution of negative events that affect the world to reach the point, but the motivation and entire justification in them doing so at all, which she failed at, mentioning to how her father died relying on supers. That her entire plot revolved around this idea that relying on supers kept them back from humans doing things for themselves, like going to hide from the killers, using this tech to turn it against people's positive opinions about them to make them untrustworthy like the supers themselves she hates for not being there in the first place. Where, okay, maybe not like that in terms of how it's played out, but she just can't be angry at all for the supers for a problem that they weren't even involved with in the first place. You just can't say things like that because it has no reason for you to generalize a group of people other than a simple mistake thinking he couldn't trust in his unwavering faith of an idea that society didn't want anymore. Yes, there is some point to how her argument plays out in terms of something similar to what Syndrome felt, but it's all downgraded to a pointless degree where it's already been solved at the beginning, where it's about keeping the law as is, not changing what was decided. She's not attempting anything grand like what we did in the first with Syndrome that provides a better reason why life was directly impacted by the supers. When we bring up these certain comparisons, we look back on that same statement I just made earlier about how motivations make a villain or actually break it. When it comes to Syndrome, Mr. Incredible himself played a role in the part that affected the villain that Buddy looked up to in becoming a hero himself. Incrediboy with all his love and inventions, but how he was rejected by that own hero himself, leading down this darker path that they shouldn't trust him at all, instead of, father died because he was too ignorant to hide. So in terms of the events of the original, he goes out to invent weapons and other tools to prove how much he doesn't need supers, gadgets that society could use to solve their own problems rather than the people who had been in charge for a while, getting rid of the old solution by any means necessary too, with his Omnidroids that almost killed off every major super in existence at the time until Mr. Incredible came in to stop him once and for all. His actions are made out of his loneliness of people rejecting him for who he could have been, and doing it himself because he thinks he could be more than what they ever would have been. Where at the end, he meets his own gruesome and deserved fate by the thing that he inspired to be like because his own desires were just selfish. Where instead here, you just have Syndrome Light situation not affected by such events directly, and that wasn't even caused by supers themselves but by society that already deemed them for what she wanted to do in the beginning. Saying it's wrong to trust into such people because we should rely on our own abilities rather than waiting for the next chance someone else can get to save the day. We shouldn't be just waiting for other people because that's not how it works, but then doing that same exact thing to others, like providing Elastigirl with her technology tools because that somehow makes her right. That despite helping Elastigirl at first, she still betrays her because it validates to how it's wrong to count on others for help, especially if they are supers because they hold all the powers. But this just doesn't really help her argument because of what we experienced in the past hour of the film. A genuine person willing to help others in society because it's a duty and understanding to how that will all play out, compared to a person who's willy-nilly diving into getting supers back from a business perspective, who is revealed instead to have no idea that this is happening at all and is actually a good guy with good motivations, it turns out. Which just doesn't make sense to me because that seems like a more logical choice because he's willing to help all of them come back. Someone who's not involved with government but is actually a high-up business executive. Because then you understand that to commit to such plans, she has to use the supers to destroy such supers, or uphold the law as it really seems compared to her brother's campaign, if that makes any sense to you. Where the question you're actually asking yourself right now is, why do I actually think this is ultimately lame with the behind the scenes path we move forward? Well, the answer to that is simply within the past again, where I mentioned that Syndrome did the ultimate answer that was dark in nature, by killing every super he could find with his own advanced tech to prove the same point that society didn't need them because he has the technology that provides for them. But now instead downgraded where she hypnotizes the supers to do her will of the very same thing that society has been doing since the very beginning of the very first film too, that her motivations again were already answered just after Helen and Bob got married way back when, and how this doesn't challenge anything greater than the status quo than making her look stupid for providing help from beginning to end. That I don't think it's a bad thing to have someone like her background of tech to be in charge of most of these antagonizing events, but how it's motivated by a simple theme that doesn't seek to change things as is. The avenue of control that most villains are accustomed to, whether it be by a crime or anything that stands against what supers fight for in society. Again, something else like a other villain that would actually contradict their very goals would make much more sense. Sure, most people can try to solve things on their own, but it still takes the will of people to even try, when most people are still not the same. Because look back on how Syndrome viewed the world and realize how much evil that there is currently, that it does really exist, and the argument for supers are still more valid than not. It's not about fully relying on them to solve their own problems, it's more about the duty of the selfless when things actually do go wrong. Not everything is guaranteed to be protected, even if some could have done it themselves, and there are others who stand up above the grain to actually provide because they demonstrate that they are able to care. I mean, what's not better than having someone to use that to their advantage to commit crimes or do the opposite for more personal gain as a better villain? To have these things that you love to your heart's desire that would fit better for more characters like Winston or anyone else that has a power advantage. Again, you turn the goals on their head that contradict the actual gain for the selfless use of society rather than the selfish use of an individual. The same desire that built Syndrome for the fame and glory that he came to be with such lifestyle, and not the bitterness that a dad got killed by a robber that has nothing to do with the supers other than the fact he tried to get their help rather than, his own. Everything in this particular family was built on this very stupid idea that their father got killed, and you can't really agree with anything that they do. Like, the only thing at the end that she even remotely attempts to have one super die is when she claims she ruined the reputation of supers from ever becoming legal again, even after her brother realized the mistake that she was making and doing something that was pure evil. Where the document the ambassadors and other government officials already signed to make that legal decision final, where she just waited after that to really drive in her point for some reason. Like, she lost the moment she even had a singular advantage that she thought she won against her greatest opponent, and that's just idiotic as hell. How am I supposed to support her existence as a character, or as a villain more importantly, now that she failed so hard and wants to die at the end, pushing her away to help justify the fact she's right? It just doesn't make any logical sense to it. Because at the finale of the film, when she does get captured and they stop the ship from causing a big crash in the city, she still comes up with a crappy excuse to justify her not being right to not trust anyone or lend help like the supers themselves.
The fact that you saved me doesn't make you right.
Like, what are you on, woman? You could have just died for nothing, and now you just appear ungrateful for the fact that you're alive and was saved at the last moment by two supers because they actually care. They serve a duty that not everyone can do themselves in the most dangerous of situations, and you don't even feel like it makes their side of the argument right, if that makes a smidge of sense to you. This is so stupid, and why I wanted to create this video in the first place, because, it feels so inconsequential compared to her previous villain who died by a freaking jet explosion. Remember, everything she did do was still going along to help Elastigirl until the very last second to make them legal, and then reversing course to keep them illegal instead. It's just not well thought out in any way you can think about it that takes them to that certain point. The only way that this could make sense is if both of the Deavors actually made it a point to be behind this for their own personal gain. Because if you look at that, you learn to like that angle more, because all of this was for their own purpose to make heroes legal to enrich themselves for their own desires, to fulfill the fact that their father was for supers and how they actually wanted to be connected with them, with the screenslaver being a dishonest attempt to change public opinion to make them legal rather than a natural course of action like Syndrome, that the villain was manufactured so it could help some sort of argument that they were searching for. But instead, that was not the route that they actually even took, and it really hurts to make another human type villain with no power because it doesn't really change things from that first. What about someone with powers who has been changed by society, who feels like it's time to go above them after they were made illegal? This is also another interesting angle as a villain, as it does tell the state of people of how they feel things when it comes to the message of the first, and how Bob himself was fed up with the mediocrity of society, willing to let things go wrong just because they can or feel like they're capable enough. If you have the parallel of an anti-version of what Bob was trying to do, it makes more logical sense to continue because you're continuing the same themes in a different sort of way. There's more reasons within that world rather than the one point that just can't make it so because they weren't there. Society has many layers layers to it, and they never really explored that with whatever they were given time to set back on. It is solely in the effect that a person has that plays a great role in what they're able and meant to do. This again, when we look back on my or many other videos, was a consequence of Disney utilizing the twist villain with no effect where it made any sense at all, where instead of the more sensible traditional roles that has been used to and worked for the company as a long time, they just went for the cheap punch out, trying to keep the audience surprised without any greater justification. The better option that could have benefited from, with the way it was finally formed, was with these two together to create a situation that benefits their own personal desire and gain, all through the screenslaver of controlling what people see. That control is more important than freedom, as most supers are more accustomed to. Because in this day and age, the media is something most people have learned to hate in today's society, through a plot that the supers could stop to reveal the truth of how they're being lied to and why some in society need to see more than meets the eye. That they can use all of that to the film's advantage of what they need for themselves rather than an honest obligation to the public. Where finally, to remind yourselves, it is more about the problem that the villain was trying to solve something that was already at the start of the film even, without adding anything new. That even if the motivation was built more on the fact that relying on supers is bad, rather than upset that your dad didn't actually hide like a reasonable person, it still does not change the fact that she herself was removing the solution she was motivated to achieve all along, only there because she is the brother to the main man who wants to save supers yet again. Like, the core essence of what she believes in gets ruined because it's simply not true by her own very actions and the willingness others showed that they can care, including with her own death that apparently she did not apply to herself. Ungrateful for a fact that should be thanked regardless, even if we do or do not rely on it. It's not about having to make others do the work instead of ourselves, it's about having people go above and beyond to care for everyone rather than their own desire. A message that Mr. Incredible learned too about being a hero in the first, and the importance of what family truly is. That this just became a movie about nothing but removing the last piece of the original puzzle of that idea and some crazy side adventures added on, with the focus of being there for your family and the consequences if you don't, including with a villain that tears those ideas apart and how she doesn't prove that very point well. And until that problem is done away with, then everything with this franchise is just painfully over. And I'm all done. Goodbye.